Earlier today, the Supreme Court dealt a major blow to church-state separation. It was a huge gift to conservative Christians especially. But because the legalese gets a bit complicated, you may have only seen the headlines. Something about religious schools getting scholarship money. So I'm going to try to explain the background of the case so that it makes sense before getting into what the decision actually said. If nothing else, I hope it helps you understand what actually went down today. Here's the background. In 2015, the heavily Republican Montana legislature passed a bill giving a $150 tax credit to people who funded private school scholarships through a program they created for it. But it didn't take a rocket scientist to understand what those lawmakers were really doing. Just realize 70% of the private schools in Montana have a religious affiliation, and it's not like that religion is Islam. This was nothing more than a way to encourage more donations to private Christian schools while using taxpayer money to reward those who donated. The one organization that emerged from that law, called Big Sky Scholarships, ultimately gave out scholarships to dozens of families to 13 different schools. And wouldn't you know it, 12 of them were religious. Oh, and 12 of them were Christian. Shocking. So if the lawmakers were trying to create a secular law to really help religious schools, it worked. Until, that is, there was a lawsuit. And this case got in front of the Montana Supreme Court. The argument was that Article 10, Section 6 of the state's constitution forbids taxpayer money from funding religious schools. It says that explicitly. But here was this law doing just that. Now, supporters of the law said tax credits aren't really public funds, and the donations are not funding religion per se. They're helping students. It's not like the scholarships were being used to send kids on mission trips. But it was easy to see the problem with that logic. If Christian schools can offer scholarships to students because of a law that rewards people who fund those scholarships, you are kind of giving a boost to those religious schools. And of course, those religious schools only exist to propagate their religious beliefs. You can't pretend that's not happening. They might teach creationism. They obviously promote the Bible and religious myths. They may discriminate against LGBTQ people in hiring. The group Americans United for Separation of Church and State even called this law a money laundering scheme. So the Montana Supreme Court heard all this. And in December of 2018, they voted 5-2 to strike down that tax incentive program. One of the judges even wrote, "That type of government subsidy in aid of sectarian schools is precisely what the delegates intended Article 10, Section 6 to prohibit." In English, they said, you're doing something our laws literally say you cannot do. The end result was that they shut down the state's tax credit program. They did not say the program can stay, but religious schools can't get money. They did not single out religious schools. They said this whole program is broken, so we're tossing it all out. And as you can imagine, the people who liked the scholarship program did not like that decision. They said if there's a program that helps all private schools, then the courts can't strike it down just because it also helps religious schools. They even brought up a Supreme Court decision from a few years ago to bolster their argument. And if you're not familiar with the case, this is important. In that case, Trinity Lutheran, the state of Missouri created a program to help schools renovate their playgrounds and make them safer for kids. Sounds great. But when Trinity Lutheran Church applied for that funding, because they also had a playground at their church school, the state said no, because their constitution prohibited state funding to go to churches. The church sued, and the church won. The Supreme Court said if there's a state-run program that's open to everyone, we don't care what your laws say about church-state separation. You cannot just reject churches from an otherwise neutral program. That is religious discrimination. So you could see why the supporters of the Montana law said, we're in the same situation. The scholarships were open to private schools. You can't just end the program because religious schools are included in the mix. One woman, Kendra Espinoza, said that without the scholarships, her daughters couldn't attend a private Christian school. To which I would respond, that's not true. Of course her kids could get a scholarship. Religious schools could continue to offer them. Donors could always fund them. Those donors just should not be getting a reward from the government for doing so. That's what this case was about. Conservatives claimed what the Montana court did was a form of religious discrimination, but remember that scrapping the whole program, which Montana did, was much different than blocking money from going to religious schools specifically. So that brings us to today's decision, written by Chief Justice John Roberts in the case of Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. It was a 5-4 victory for the conservatives on the court. But Roberts' ruling was convoluted enough that it invoked 3 separate concurrences from justices who agreed with him but had their own unique takes on it, and 3 separate dissents. Here's the bottom line. Roberts said the Montana Supreme Court was wrong to shut down the scholarship program simply because the schools in question were religious. He also said this, which is the crux of the case. This is the statement everyone's quoting. A state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. That's a weird statement. He's saying if a state funds private schools at all, which 29 states and DC and Puerto Rico do, now suddenly they have to fund religious schools too. Roberts found a way to make taxpayers fund religious education. The same court said Obama can't force Christian business owners to provide comprehensive health care to employees because birth control may violate the owner's religious beliefs, but now Jewish and Muslim and atheist taxpayers will have to fund Christian preaching. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was very blunt in her dissent, saying not only is the court wrong to decide this case at all, it decides it wrongly. She also said today's ruling is perverse. She pointed out that Roberts' ruling seems to say Montana must reinstate its law. But since when does the Constitution give people a right to a private school scholarship program? It's like once you build it, it's now impossible to get rid of it. You might think there's a fix here. What if all these states just stop funding private schools? No more tax credits, no more vouchers. That would be great, but Republicans in a lot of states won't go for that. And even if a state got rid of voucher programs in light of today's decision, you can bet Christian legal groups would just say, this is evidence of religious discrimination. This may be the first time the Supreme Court has allowed taxpayer money to be used to endorse religious proselytizing and religious discrimination in private schools. No wonder Slate said the decision bulldozed the wall separating church and state. It was a horrible decision, and it was only possible because Republicans have taken over the Supreme Court. This is why white evangelicals put up with everything Trump does, for court victories like this one.